The monitors in the maternity ward were the only things screaming, a rhythmic electronic pulse that mocked the silence of the man standing by the door. Ellen Ripley Gump clutched the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, her knuckles white, her breath hitching as a fresh wave of labor pains tore through her. She looked up, sweat matting her hair to her forehead, reaching out a trembling hand for the man she'd loved for 3 years. But Jack Torrance Vader didn't move toward her. He moved toward the exit. He didn't look back at the woman carrying his son, he looked at his watch. With a cold, clinical precision that felt like a blade to the chest, he reached into his wallet, pulled out 2 crumpled $20 bills and a 15, and dropped them on the plastic bedside tray. "This is all the cash I have, Ellen," he whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised her a lifetime. "I can't do this. I'm not built for diapers and poverty. I have a life waiting for me in the city, a real life." "Jack, please," she gasped, the monitors flatlining in her ears as her heart skipped a beat. "The baby, he's coming now. You can't leave us with $55. We have nothing." He didn't answer. He simply turned the handle, the heavy fire door hissing shut behind him, leaving Ellen alone in the sterile white light with the crushing weight of a future she hadn't asked for. Hello to all of our incredible viewers joining us today. Before we dive deeper into this harrowing journey of betrayal and ultimate justice, I want to say a massive hello to each and every one of you. Whether you're watching from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet suburbs of London, or anywhere else across the globe, we are so grateful to have you here in our storytelling community. How are you doing today? We hope you're feeling inspired and ready for a story that proves the universe always keeps its receipts. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our family. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful, emotional stories to life. Are you subscribed yet? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love reading your stories too. Now let's get back to Ellen, who is about to face the hardest night of her life. The $55 sat on the tray like a tombstone. Ellen stared at the money, the price Jack had put on his own flesh and blood. Every cent represented a minute of the 3 years she had wasted believing his lies. As the nurses rushed in, sensing her distress and the baby's imminent arrival, Ellen felt a cold, hard shell begin to form around her heart. She wasn't just a woman in labor anymore. She was a woman in survival mode. She looked at the bills, then at the empty doorway and made a silent vow. She wouldn't die in this hospital and neither would her son. But as the first cry of her newborn shattered the silence of the room, a terrifying thought took root. How do you raise a king on the wages of a ghost? And more importantly, what happens when that ghost decides 18 years later that he wants to haunt the palace you built from the ashes? Ellen held her son, Peter Parker Skywalker, and whispered into his tiny ear, "He thinks he left us with nothing, Peter. But he left us with the one thing he'll never have, a reason to never give up." She didn't know then that 18 years later Jack Torrance Vader would be standing in a boardroom, his billion-dollar empire crumbling, looking into the eyes of a young man who shared his face but possessed a soul he could never comprehend. She didn't know that the $55 would eventually become the most expensive debt Jack would ever have to pay. The years that followed that cold night in the maternity ward weren't just a struggle. They were a masterclass in resilience. Ellen Ripley Gump didn't just survive. She hardened into a woman of titanium and grace. She took that $55 and bought a bus ticket to a town where no one knew her name, eventually landing a job scrubbing floors at a local tech firm. By day she cleaned the glass offices of men who looked right through her, but by night she sat in the glow of a flickering lamp, teaching herself the very systems she spent her shifts dusting. Her deepest desire was never wealth, it was security. She lived with the constant low-grade fever of fear that one day, the floor would drop out from under her again. This fear drove her to work 3 jobs, to skip meals so Peter could have new shoes, and to eventually climb the corporate ladder from janitor to lead systems architect. She was a woman of few words, her eyes always scanning for the exit, a habit born from a betrayal that had never truly stopped stinging. Peter Parker Skywalker grew up in the shadow of his mother's strength. At 18 he was a mirror image of the father he had never met, possessing the same sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, but tempered by Ellen's warmth. Peter was a prodigy, a self-taught coder who saw the world in patterns and logic. But beneath his brilliant mind lay a hidden wound, a desperate need to understand why he wasn't enough to make a man stay. He never asked about his father. He saw the flash of pain in Ellen's eyes whenever a dad appeared on a TV screen, but he kept a small dented tin box under his bed. Inside wasn't a photo but a single photocopied image of 3 crumpled bills, 2 20s and a 15. Ellen had kept the original as a reminder and Peter kept the copy as a fuel. Their world was small but solid, anchored by Sarah Connor Doyle, Ellen's best friend and the woman who had babysat Peter in a drafty apartment while Ellen worked double shifts. Sarah was a firebrand with a sharp tongue and a heart of gold, the only person who knew the full story of Jack's exit. She was the one who reminded Ellen that she was a queen, even when she smelled like industrial bleach. "You're building an empire, Ellen," Sarah would say, watching a young Peter take apart a broken toaster just to see how it worked. "And one day that man is going to realize he didn't just leave a woman behind. He left the sun and now he's living in the dark." Meanwhile, in a glass and steel penthouse 300 miles away, Jack Torrance Vader lived the life he'd traded his soul for. He was the CEO of Apex Zenith, a venture capital firm that specialized in restructuring, a polite word for gutting companies and selling the parts. He was surrounded by luxury, Italian leather, vintage scotch, and a social circle of people who only liked him for his balance sheet. But Jack had a secret. For all his status, he was drowning. A series of aggressive high-risk gambles had left Apex Zenith on the verge of a hostile takeover. He was desperate for a miracle, a new piece of technology or a brilliant mind to save his reputation. He spent his nights staring out at the city skyline, haunted not by guilt. He had long ago convinced himself that Ellen was better off without a drifter like him, but by a growing sense of emptiness. He had no heir, no legacy, only a cold marble tomb of an apartment. He had spent 18 years running from the poverty and diapers he feared, only to find that he had built a cage out of gold. He told himself he was a winner, but every time he saw a mother and child in the park, his hand would instinctively twitch toward his pocket, as if feeling for the phantom weight of $55. The stakes were quietly being set. Ellen had reached the pinnacle of her career, now the chief technology officer of a rival firm, Nova Corps. Peter had just been accepted into a prestigious fellowship that would place him in the heart of the city's financial district. The collision was no longer a matter of if, but when. The secret Ellen kept, the fact that she had tracked Jack's rise with the precision of a predator, was beginning to itch. She didn't want his money anymore. She wanted his recognition of the debt. And Peter, standing on the precipice of adulthood, was starting to realize that the logic of coding couldn't solve the mystery of his own blood. "Mom," Peter asked one evening as they packed his bags for the city, "do you think people ever really change? Or do they just get better at hiding who they are?" Ellen looked at her son, seeing the ghost of Jack in his silhouette, and felt a chill. "Some people don't change, Peter. They just wait for the world to catch up to their mistakes." The collision happened not in a dark alley or a courtroom, but in the sterile, high-pressure atmosphere of the Titan Summit, an exclusive gala for the tech industry's elite. Ellen Ripley Gump stood at the edge of the ballroom, her silk gown the color of a bruised midnight sky. She watched Peter Parker Skywalker move through the crowd with an effortless confidence that made her heart ache. He was there as the youngest ever recipient of the Innovators Grant, and he looked every bit the prince she had raised him to be. Across the room, Jack Torrance Vader was nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. The rumors of Apex Zenith's insolvency were reaching a fever pitch. He needed a partnership, a buyout, or a miracle. His gaze landed on the stage where the young prodigy was being introduced. "And now," the announcer's voice boomed, "to present the keynote on the future of autonomous systems, please welcome Peter Parker Skywalker." The glass in Jack's hand trembled. The name meant nothing but the face, it was like looking into a temporal rift. It was his own face, 30 years younger, stripped of the cynicism and the rot. Beside him, his lead consultant whispered, "That kid's algorithm is the most valuable IP in the sector. Whoever signs him tonight owns the next decade." Jack didn't hear the business strategy. He heard the ghost of a woman's scream in a hospital room 18 years ago. As Peter finished his speech to thunderous applause, Jack intercepted him near the champagne fountain. "Impressive work, son," Jack said, his voice smooth and predatory. He didn't know yet. He thought it was just a coincidence of genetics, a lucky break he could exploit. "I'm Jack, CEO of Apex. I think we have a lot to talk about regarding your future." Peter froze. He knew that voice. He had played the audio from an old grainy video clip Ellen had accidentally left on a hard drive 1,000 times. He looked at the hand Jack extended, the same hand that had dropped $55 on a tray, and walked away. "I know exactly who you are," Peter said, his voice dangerously low. The attraction of the Titan was gone, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. "But I don't think you have anything I want." Before Jack could respond, a shadow fell over them. Ellen stepped into the light, her presence cooling the air by 10 degrees. Jack's breath hitched. The janitor he had deleted from his memory was gone. In her place stood a titan of industry, her eyes like flint. "He's right, Jack," Ellen said, her voice a calm, steady blade. "He doesn't need anything from you. In fact, we were just discussing your company's restructuring. It's amazing how far $55 can go when you invest it in the right people." The twist hit Jack like a physical blow. The woman he'd abandoned was the CTO of the firm currently launching a hostile takeover of his life's work. And the boy, the burden he'd run from, was the only person who could write the code to save him. The decision was forced. Jack had to choose: admit his sins and beg for mercy from the people he'd discarded, or double down on his pride and try to crush them before they crushed him. "Ellen," Jack stammered, the scotch finally spilling over the rim of his glass. I had no idea you'd done so well for yourself. We should talk privately." "We're done talking, Jack," Ellen replied, taking Peter's arm. "From now on we'll communicate through our lawyers. And just so you know, the interest on that $55? It's finally come due." As they walked away, leaving Jack standing alone in the center of the room, the first major revelation of the night settled over the gala like a shroud. Jack wasn't just losing his company. He was realizing that the nothing he left behind had grown into the everything he now desperately needed. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in 18 years, Jack Torrance Vader was the prey. The fallout from the gala was immediate and suffocating. Within 24 hours, the industry trades were buzzing not just with news of the potential merger, but with whispered rumors of the personal vendetta fueling it. Jack Torrance Vader was a man possessed. He retreated to his high-rise bunker, fueled by caffeine and a mounting sense of panic. He didn't just need Peter Parker Skywalker's algorithm. He needed to neutralize the threat Ellen posed. Jack began a campaign of corporate excavation. He hired private investigators to dig into Ellen's past, hoping to find a scandal, a missed tax filing, or a crack in her professional armor. But the more he dug, the more he realized with a sinking heart that Ellen was bulletproof. She had lived a life of absolute transparency because she knew one day he might come looking. Meanwhile, at Nova Corps, the tension was of a different kind, a slow-burning, emotional friction. Peter was distracted. The encounter with his father had opened a door he couldn't easily close. He spent hours in the lab staring at his code, seeing Jack's eyes in every reflection. It was during one of these late-night sessions that he met Clarice Starling McLean, a brilliant security consultant hired by Ellen to oversee the takeover's data integrity. Clarice was sharp, grounded, and possessed a dry wit that acted as a balm to Peter's fraying nerves. "You're staring at the logic gate again," Clarice said, leaning against the doorframe of the lab, 2 coffees in hand. "In my experience, when the code is perfect but the coder is stuck, it's usually a hardware issue. Specifically, the heart." Peter sighed, taking the coffee. "Is it that obvious? You have the look of someone who just realized the villain in their favorite movie is actually their landlord," she countered, sitting on the edge of his desk. Over the next few weeks, their late-night debates over encryption turned into something deeper. They found common ground in their shared history of being underdogs. Clarice had fought her way up from a rough neighborhood in the city, never taking no for an answer. Their growing attraction was a quiet anchor for Peter. Clarice didn't see him as a prodigy or a legacy. She saw him as a young man trying to reconcile a ghost with a monster. But as their relationship deepened, so did the obstacles. Jack, desperate to get to Peter, began planting false clues. He leaked confidential documents suggesting that Ellen had manipulated Peter's grant application, a red herring designed to make Peter doubt his own merit and his mother's honesty. "Peter, look at this," Jack said during a forced accidental meeting outside the lab one evening. He handed Peter a forged memo. "I didn't leave because I didn't want you. I left because your mother threatened to ruin my career if I stayed. She wanted you all to herself. She's used you to get to the top, son." The seed of doubt was planted. Peter's relationship with Ellen grew strained. He began to wonder if his entire life was a carefully constructed revenge plot orchestrated by his mother. He grew distant from Clarice, fearing that she too was just another piece on Ellen's chessboard. It's getting intense, isn't it? The webs people weave can be so complex. I see so many of you nodding along. We've all felt that sting of doubt at some point. If you're enjoying how these layers are unfolding, make sure to leave a comment below and tell us. Do you think Jack is capable of real change, or is he just a master manipulator? We love hearing your theories. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this justice-filled journey. Now let's see if Peter falls for the trap. The frustration in the Nova Corps offices was palpable. Ellen noticed the change in her son. The way he avoided her gaze, the way his shoulders slumped. She knew Jack was playing dirty. She had expected it, but seeing the pain in Peter's eyes was a price she hadn't anticipated. She found him on the balcony of their apartment looking out at the city lights. "He's talking to you, isn't he?" Ellen asked softly. "He says you lied," Peter replied, his voice tight. "He says the $55 was a story you told to make me hate him." Ellen didn't get angry. She didn't shout. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out a small laminated piece of paper. It was the original hospital receipt, dated 18 years ago. Attached to it was a handwritten note Jack had left with the nurse. A note she had never shown Peter. "She's your problem now. Don't contact me. I'm moving on to bigger things." Peter took the paper. His hands shook as he read the cold, dismissive handwriting. The false clues Jack had planted crumbled under the weight of the truth. "He didn't just leave the money, Peter," Ellen whispered. "He left his humanity. I didn't raise you to hate him. I raised you to be so much better than him that he would eventually become irrelevant to your story." The realization hit Peter like a tidal wave. He had been so focused on the mystery of his father that he had momentarily forgotten the reality of his mother. His resolve hardened. He realized that the only way to truly defeat Jack wasn't just to take his company. It was to show him that he no longer had the power to confuse or hurt them. But Jack had one more card to play. He knew the hostile takeover was 48 hours away. If he couldn't win Peter over, he would have to destroy the very thing Peter loved most: his mother's reputation. Jack prepared to release a doctored video that would frame Ellen for corporate espionage. The tension had reached its breaking point. Hope was a thin thread, and the attraction between Peter and Clarice was the only thing keeping him grounded as the world prepared to explode. The boardrooms of Apex Zenith were cold, even with the heating dialed to the maximum. Jack Torrance Vader sat at the head of a mahogany table that felt more like an altar for a sacrifice. He had the doctored video ready to upload. It was a deep fake sophisticated enough to ruin Ellen Ripley Gump and stall the takeover. But just as his finger hovered over the enter key, the double doors swung open. It wasn't a process server or a lawyer who walked in. It was Peter. "I know about the video, Jack," Peter Parker Skywalker said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. He walked forward, tossing a slim silver flash drive onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Jack's manicured hand. Jack sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "You're too late, son. I'm protecting my legacy. Your mother started this war. I'm just finishing it." "That's the thing," Peter said, leaning over the table, his shadow looming large over his father. "You think your legacy is this building. You think it's the stock price. But I've been digging into the Apex archives. The stuff you thought you deleted when you restructured the company 10 years ago." Jack's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" "The $55, Peter whispered. "It wasn't just pocket change, was it? I found the original ledger from your first startup. You didn't just walk away from us because you were scared. You walked away because you had embezzled $55,000 from your first partners to seed Apex. And you knew if you stayed at that hospital the police would find you. You used us as a distraction. You let Ellen take the fall for your disappearance while you changed your name and moved across the country." The revelation was a game changer. This wasn't just a story of a deadbeat dad. It was a story of a fugitive who had built a billion-dollar empire on a foundation of theft. Jack hadn't just abandoned a family. He had escaped a prison sentence by leaving a pregnant woman to face his creditors. Everything Ellen and Peter believed about their past shifted in a heartbeat. Ellen hadn't just been struggling against poverty. She had been unknowingly shielding Peter from the criminal shadow of a man who was still technically a wanted fraudster in 3 states. "You're bluffing," Jack hissed, but his hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table. "I'm not," Peter said. "And here's the best part. That algorithm you want, the one you think will save Apex, it doesn't just manage data. It's a forensic auditor. I've already set it loose on your offshore accounts. By tomorrow morning, every cent you've hidden since 2008 will be flagged by the Treasury." In that moment of absolute high stakes, the power dynamic didn't just shift. It flipped entirely. Jack wasn't the hunter anymore. He was a man whose entire life was revealed to be a fragile, illegal glass house. But as the professional walls closed in, a different kind of vulnerability emerged. Peter looked at the man who shared his DNA and felt a profound, unexpected wave of pity. He saw the desperation in Jack's eyes, the passion of a man who had nothing left but his lies. "Why, Jack?" Peter asked, his voice cracking for the first time. "Was it worth it? All this gold for a life where you can't even look your own son in the eye?" For a split second the mask slipped. Jack looked down at the $55 worth of crumpled bills Peter had placed on the table. The original bills Alan had saved for 18 years. "I was a coward, Peter," Jack whispered, the confession tasting like ash. "I thought if I had enough money I could buy a version of myself that wasn't a thief." "You can't buy a soul, Jack," Peter replied. The midpoint of their battle had reached its peak. The romantic connection between Peter and Clarice, who had helped him unearth the digital trail of Jack's crimes, was now forged in the fire of shared secrets. They weren't just colleagues. They were partners in a crusade for the truth. But as Peter turned to leave, Jack's desperation curdled into something darker. He realized that if he was going down, he didn't have to go alone. He reached for his phone. He didn't upload the deepfake of Ellen. Instead, he made a call to a contact in the underworld, a fixer he'd used for years to keep his secrets buried. "The boy is a liability," Jack said into the receiver, his voice cold and dead. "And the woman knows too much. Clear the board. Do whatever it takes." The stakes had moved beyond the boardroom. The revelation had stripped Jack of his company, but it had also stripped him of his last shred of morality. The darkest hour was approaching, and the $55 was about to be paid for in blood. The victory in the boardroom felt like a hollow triumph the moment Peter Parker Skywalker stepped out into the rainy city night. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and impending disaster. He tried to call Clarice Starling McLean, needing to hear her voice, but his phone hissed with static before dying completely, a targeted digital blackout. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. Back at the Nova Corps headquarters, the lights flickered and died. Ellen Ripley Gump stood in her office, the city skyline blurring through the rain-streaked glass. She heard the soft thud of the heavy oak doors locking from the outside. Suddenly, the monitors in her office flared to life, but they weren't displaying code. They showed a live feed of Peter walking toward his car in the parking garage, unaware of the black SUV idling in the shadows behind him. "Jack, don't do this," Ellen whispered to the empty room, her breath fogging the glass. Then a voice crackled over the intercom, not Jack's but the cold, mechanical tone of his fixer. "Mr. Torrance Vader doesn't like loose ends, Ms. Ripley Gump. You should have taken the $55 and stayed in the gutter." The trap snapped shut. In the garage, Peter was blindsided. 2 men emerged from the gloom, and before he could react, a heavy blow to the back of his head sent the world spinning into darkness. He woke up minutes later, zip-tied to a chair in a damp, abandoned warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, the very place where Jack's first failed business had once stood. The separation was agonizing. Ellen was trapped in a high-rise fortress, watching her son's life hang by a thread on a digital screen she could no longer control. Clarice, realizing Peter had gone missing, raced toward his last known GPS coordinate, only to find his smashed phone in a puddle. She was alone, outgunned and terrified. Inside the warehouse, Jack Torrance Vader emerged from the shadows. He didn't look like a CO anymore, he looked like a ghost. His suit was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He held a heavy folder of documents, the evidence of his embezzlement. "I could have loved you, Peter," Jack said, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of grief and rage. "But you chose her. You chose the woman who wanted to destroy me. Now I have to burn it all down to make sure the fire doesn't reach me." He doused the crates surrounding Peter with accelerant. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, stinging Peter's eyes as he struggled against his restraints. "You're killing your own son to save a lie," Peter choked out, his head throbbing. "Is that the legacy you want? A pile of ash?" "It's not murder if nobody finds the body, Peter. It's just a tragic accident in an old building." Jack struck a match. The small flame danced in the darkness, reflecting in the eyes of a man who had completely lost his way. At that moment, the situation appeared utterly hopeless. Ellen was screaming at a monitor, her fingernails bloody from clawing at the reinforced glass of her office door. Clarice was lost in the maze of the industrial docks. And Peter was seconds away from becoming a footnote in Jack's criminal history. The weight of 18 years of struggle, of $55 budgets and sleepless nights, seemed to be culminating in a silent, fiery end. The man who had walked away at the hospital was now preparing to walk away from a funeral. The emotional focus shifted from the fire of anger to the cold, paralyzing weight of despair. Peter looked at his father not with fear, but with a devastating realization. Jack wasn't a titan. He was a hollow man, so terrified of the dark that he would burn the sun just to see for one more second. "Do it then," Peter whispered, his voice steady even as the match dropped toward the gasoline. "But know that even in the dark, my mother will never stop until the world knows what you are." The match flickered in the air, a tiny, lethal spark falling toward the river of gasoline. But it never touched the floor. A sudden, deafening crack of glass shattered the oppressive silence of the warehouse. A high-pressure burst from a fire extinguisher hit the match mid-air, snuffing the flame and clouding the room in a thick, white chemical fog. Through the haze, a figure emerged. Not a soldier but a woman driven by 18 years of banked fire. Ellen Ripley Gump hadn't waited for the fixer to finish his game. She had used the very system she'd designed for Nova Corps to override the building's security from her tablet, then used a backup manual release she'd installed herself months prior. She hadn't just escaped, she had arrived like a storm. Beside her, Clarice Starling McLean moved with tactical precision, her hand steady as she leveled a stun device at the shadows where the fixer lurked. "Step away from my son, Jack," Ellen commanded. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrating hum of pure authority. Jack scrambled back, coughing as the chemical dust coated his expensive suit. "Ellen? How?" "The doors were deadlocked." "I built the locks, Jack," Ellen said, walking toward Peter. She didn't look at the gasoline or the threat. She looked only at her son. With a pocket knife she'd carried since her days scrubbing floors, she sliced through Peter's zip ties in one fluid motion. "I built everything you tried to break." As Peter stood, rubbing his bruised wrists, the despair that had clouded the warehouse evaporated, replaced by a surge of collective strength. He looked at Clarice, whose eyes shone with relief and a fierce, protective love. In that moment of reunion, the three of them stood as a united front. The mother who survived, the son who thrived, and the woman who chose to stand by him. "It's over, Jack," Peter said, his voice regaining its melodic strength. "The fixer you called?" Clarice's team intercepted his transmission. "The police aren't just coming for a fire. They're coming for the man who stole $55,000 and spent 18 years trying to bury the witnesses." The realization hit Jack like a physical weight. The key to solving the conflict wasn't just the algorithm or the takeover. It was the fact that he had underestimated the very people he thought were beneath him. He had viewed them as variables to be deleted, but they were the architects of his downfall. Ellen stepped forward, holding out her hand. For a second Jack thought she might strike him. Instead she dropped something into his palm. It was the original $55. The 220s and the 15 now worn and soft like fabric. "Keep it," Ellen whispered. "You're going to need it for the vending machines in the visiting room. Consider it the only mercy you'll ever get from us." Hope flooded the room, brighter than any fire Jack could have lit. The turning point was complete. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of justice. They weren't running anymore. They were standing their ground, waiting for the sirens that were already screaming in the distance. The sirens were no longer a distant hum. They were a deafening rhythmic roar that bounced off the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse. Blue and red lights pulsed through the grime-streaked windows, turning the swirling chemical fog into a chaotic neon kaleidoscope. Jack Torrance Vader looked at the $55 in his palm as if the paper were made of live embers. He looked at the exit, then at the three people standing between him and his shattered legacy. The fixer, seeing the game was up, attempted to bolt through a side-loading dock, but Clarice Starling McLean was faster. With a move born of years of training, she swept his legs and pinned him to the oil-slicked floor. "Stay down," Clarice hissed, the click of her handcuffs echoing like a gavel. "Your contract just expired." But Jack wasn't looking at his hired help. He was looking at Peter Parker Skywalker, who was now holding the silver flash drive, the digital executioner of Apex Zenith. "You think this makes you a hero?" Jack spat, his voice cracking with the last of his arrogance. "You're destroying a company that employs thousands. You're tearing down a pillar of this city for a grudge over $55. "No, Jack," Peter said, stepping closer until he was inches from the man who had abandoned him. "I'm not destroying a company. I'm excising a tumor. The board of directors has already been notified. They've seen the forensic audit. By tomorrow morning, Nova Corps will absorb the assets, the employees will keep their jobs, and the only thing that will be torn down is your name on the front of the building." The final confrontation wasn't a physical battle. It was the systematic dismantling of a liar's world. As the police burst through the main doors, led by officers who had already received the encrypted files from Clarice, Jack realized he had no moves left. He tried to hide the $55 in his pocket, a pathetic attempt to cling to the only thing he had left, but it fluttered to the floor, landing in a puddle of gasoline and chemical foam. Ellen Ripley Gump watched as the lead detective approached. She didn't look triumphant, she looked at peace. The weight she had carried for 18 years, the shame of being discarded, the exhaustion of the climb, was visibly lifting. "Is this the man?" the detective asked, gesturing toward Jack. "That's him," Ellen said, her voice clear and resonant. "He's been running for a long time. It's time for him to sit still." As the officers moved to arrest Jack, he suddenly lunged forward. It wasn't an attack but a desperate final attempt to reclaim some shred of his status. He reached for Peter's arm, his eyes wide with a terrifying, hollow pleading. "Peter, tell them I'm your father. I can give you everything. I can make you the king of this city." Peter didn't flinch. He didn't pull away in anger. He simply looked at Jack with a profound, quiet authority that made the older man seem small. "A father is someone who stays when the money runs out," Peter said, his voice carrying the weight of his mother's 18-year sacrifice. "You're just a man who left a debt. And today the account is closed." The most satisfying twist wasn't the arrest or the corporate takeover. It was the moment Jack realized that his own son was the person who had finally, irrevocably, made him irrelevant. The man who had chased status his whole life was now being led away in plastic zip ties, his name already being erased from the digital ledgers of the world. As the police led Jack toward the waiting cruisers, he looked back one last time. He saw Ellen, Peter, and Clarice standing together, silhouetted by the dawn light beginning to break through the warehouse rafters. They weren't a tragedy anymore. They were a masterpiece. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been engineered. The $55 had been the seed of a forest that had eventually grown to swallow the man who planted it in spite. "I don't know about you, but I've got chills. Seeing Jack finally face the music after all those years. It's exactly what he deserved. Justice is a dish best served with a side of absolute truth." The sun finally crested the horizon, painting the city skyline in hues of gold and lavender, a stark contrast to the sterile white lights of the hospital 18 years ago. Ellen Ripley Gump stood on the steps of the precinct, the cool morning air filling her lungs with a lightness she hadn't felt since she was a girl. The legal storm had broken, and in its wake the air was clear. Jack Torrance Vader was gone, processed into a system that didn't care about his Italian leather shoes or his high-rise office. The legacy he had traded his family for was now a matter of public record, a cautionary tale of greed and its inevitable expiration date. Peter Parker Skywalker walked toward his mother, his hand intertwined with Clarice Starling McLean's. The tension that had tightened Peter's features for weeks had smoothed out, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. He wasn't just Jack's shadow or Ellen's project. He was a pioneer, a protector, and a man who had earned his place in the sun. "It's done, Mom," Peter said, pulling Ellen into a tight embrace. "The board approved the transition. Nova Corps is setting up a foundation in your name, a fund for single mothers who need more than just $55 to start over." Ellen pulled back, her eyes shining with a rare, happy moisture. It was never about the money, Peter. It was about making sure you never had to feel like a cost to be managed. I never did, Peter replied, looking at Clarice. I had everything I needed. The romantic subplot reached its fulfilling peak as Peter turned to Clarice. They had survived a literal fire together, and as they stood on the sidewalk, the city beginning to wake up around them, Peter realized that the patterns he saw in code were nothing compared to the connection he felt with her. They had plans, not just for the merger, but for a future built on the transparency Jack had feared. So, Clarice said with a playful smirk, now that you're a titan of industry, what's the first order of business? Peter looked at his mother, then back at the woman he loved. I think we should go get the most expensive breakfast in the city. And I'm paying with a credit card that has my own name on it. As they walked away from the precinct, the camera of fate pulled back, showing a family that had been forged in the crucible of abandonment and emerged as tempered steel. The $55 that Jack had thought would be the end of their story had instead been the first chapter of a masterpiece. Ellen stopped for a moment, looking up at the Apex building across the street. Workers were already beginning to remove the Vader name from the facade. She smiled, a genuine, joyful expression that erased years of hardship. The debt was paid. The cycle was broken. They moved forward together, three people bound not by blood alone, but by the courage to demand justice from a world that had once tried to leave them behind. The future wasn't just bright, it was theirs. And for the first time in 18 years, when Ellen Ripley Gump closed her eyes, she didn't see a sterile hospital room. She saw a horizon without limits, filled with the promise of a life where $55 was no longer a lifeline, but a memory of how far they had climbed. Love had won. Truth had triumphed. And karma, after 18 long years, had finally finished its call. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey. We hope you enjoyed seeing Ellen and Peter finally get the peace and victory they deserved. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how someone tries to leave you, you have the power to write your own ending. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you one last time. What was your favorite moment of the story? Was it the boardroom showdown or the warehouse rescue? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We have so many more incredible, heart-pounding stories coming your way, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and remember, your value is never defined by what someone else leaves behind. See you in the next story.